Hey guys, welcome into the show. Week 3 here. Hard to believe we're already 3 weeks into the season, and it just seemed like yesterday we were starting. And I'm going to go ahead and get this started while I wait for many of you all to jump online. There's a few things that I want to touch upon before we get into some of the weekly matchups, previewing Week 3, and getting into this week's start bench. One thing that I want to throw out there, especially it's important for you guys that have paid for the premium content that we offer over at the CFF site. There are still some emails coming in. Some of you all still unaware about the expanded rankings, still unaware about the projections and the password protected expanded rankings that we have. And to get into those projections, if you paid for it, get in there, guys. If you don't remember the password, send the email, the CFF site an email. We'll get back to you and get you everything that you need. But we do get a few of those during the week, so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as well. Before I start off everything, too, our thoughts are with everybody over there on the East Coast. A hurricane moving in. Obviously, it's impacted college fantasy football across the world, college football and everyday lives, and that's what's most important, guys. So, coming from and being here around the New Orleans area, I just want to throw that out at the beginning of the show that everybody's thinking about you guys and hoping everything's fine over there on the East Coast. So. Let's get into college fantasy football. What are we kind of dealt with now? We're now 3 weeks into the season. Coming up this week will be 3 weeks past the beginning of the season when this weekend's over with. And for me, I think one of the themes in college fantasy football right now is I think it's been a tough start for a number of folks for a number of you guys across the college fantasy football landscape. And let's look at why. Week 1, there were some tough matchups or favorable matchups, depending on which side of the coin you fell on, right? If you had some of those group of 5 teams, maybe you had a tough matchup, dealt a bad hand in the first week, and you kind of threw that, you kind of wrote that one off and say, okay, I know what we're getting. I was expecting that. Then all of a sudden, week 2 comes around, and all of this weather starts rolling in the Midwest, which really impacted a lot of games. As a matter of fact, there were about as many games impacted in week 2 from a weather standpoint, if not more, than maybe this week that won't be played. On that side, you still got some fantasy points. On this side of the fence, what we're faced with this week is that your hand's kind of forced. You already know that you're not going to have some players going for you. So bad matchups week 1 for a number of you all. Bad weather impacting in week 2. Maybe even some fluke injuries as well. And then now we're going into week 3 and bad weather out there again. And so I think for a number of guys, a number of fantasy owners out there, it's about surviving right now through these first 3 weeks and kind of getting to the point where we're getting a little more clarity on what's happening on depth charts, the systems that we're seeing play out before us. And really, there are still some question marks, and we're going to get into that with some guys out there. And then you're dealing with guys like Bryce Love that's now not going to play against a UC Davis. So just a real tough start. How are we going to get around that? I'm going to throw out a bunch of names on tonight's show. You guys that have the expanded rankings probably have seen many of those guys and have found some, because we go about 150 deep in the wide receiver rankings, over 100 in the running back rankings. But for me, that's really what we're trying to do right now. We don't want to punt on week number 3, right? We don't want to just kind of chalk this one off and say, oh, you know what, it's bad luck. There are a lot of other fantasy owners in the same boat that you are right now that's trying to find that one of those 1 or 2 replacement players this week that they can plug in and play into their lineups. And maybe that's what we can accomplish here on this show tonight. Because one thing I said, I said this before, I'll say it again, I say it every week, I say it to the guys that I send emails to. You know what? We're not perfect. The rankings aren't perfect. The projections aren't perfect. We hit a bunch. We miss a bunch of them. It's just the nature of the game. I'm not, even particularly with the email, and I'm not here. I'm not here to blow a horn and say, you know what, and tell you and give you advice on quote unquote, this is what you need to do. What we do here at the CFF site, what I do with these shows, what I do with the emails, what we do with the rankings, and what we do with the projections is just to complement all of the research that you do on your college fantasy football team. Offer that up to you guys so you all can use and make and take your gut decisions and your take all the research that you have done up until that point for this week and implement it and building your best lineup on a week-to-week basis. So That kind of takes care of the house cleaning for the week, and we're going to get right into the matchups. There are a bunch of games that were scheduled. There are some games that were played today. Some games just finished. I think BC and Wake Forest just finished up, and I mean, what's there not to like about AJ Dillon other than the fact that I think Brown threw for 5 touchdowns? But man, give me the guy that's going to carry the ball 30 times. So great performance by AJ Dillon. Only if he could find the end zone a little bit more. So Friday night's matchup. We're going to go right to Georgia State and Memphis. A lot more is becoming clearer now. It looks like Darrell Henderson is going to be the true running back one. I was really on board with maybe Patrick Taylor and Henderson being 1A, 1B. Taylor getting a lot more work in the red zone, but man, it's Henderson's show right now, and I just wonder if he's just going to get more touches as we go along. The question is what's going to happen with Brady White in the passing game? Are we going to see an emergence from them, any consistency from them? If you have Memphis right now and you have Henderson, he is certainly the play in a great matchup this Friday night. Tomorrow night, home against Georgia State. Georgia Southern at Clemson. I think if there's one thing that we learned last week from the Clemson-Texas A&M game, is that maybe the Trevor Lawrence show is going to have to wait for a little bit. It looks like it's going to be Kelly Bryant's show. Now, here's one thing that I will advise, and here's why Bryant's not too high in the rankings, is I still expect Trevor Lawrence to play. I still expect Trevor Lawrence to get playing time. I do think that's going to steal some fantasy points away from Kelly Bryant, so it'll be interesting to see if he continues to get playing time. T. Higgins looks like he's a big player bust. He's not going to give you a ton of catches, but if he can take one of those to the house, he's worth a start for you if you can get there. And I still am waiting for that explosion from Travis Etienne. I feel that it's coming. It could be this weekend in a matchup home against Georgia Southern. Georgia playing home against Middle Tennessee. I have to tell you, I mentioned on the show last week the whole Middle Tennessee situation with Ty Lee. A lot of people looking to jump ship on Ty Lee, and right now, I cannot blame you. I would even go so far to say I might be willing to roll the dice a little bit more with a C.J. Wyndham, who's got a little bit more size to him. However, you got to err on the side of caution. Middle Tennessee has had a bad matchup. They have a bad matchup this week. So I still think some things could, we still could have to wait a little bit with Ty Lee before we cut him off. I'm not expecting anything this week out of that Georgia game, but like I said, we're going to be 3 weeks into the season. And for many of you guys, 1/3 of the regular season is going to be over after this week. So if you're not getting anything from a player for a third of your regular season, how are you going to expect to make the playoffs? I can't blame guys for jumping ship after week 3. I always think that week 3 is the jumping off point for a lot of players. You have to give guys a mulligan on week 1 because of matchups. Maybe week 2 with weather. But man, if we're going into matchups week 3 and beyond, and Ty Lee is not giving you anything as we get into week 3 and week 4, we really got to start looking to move on. And there's going to be other guys in that boat too. The Stephen Carrs over at USC. This week will be really telling, in my opinion, on even more guys. I hate to say as the weeks go on, we become more clearer because after this week, we're a third of the way through the regular season, but you invested so much in a Stephen Carr that if you have the depth, his ceiling is too high to just kind of throw them out there on the waiver wire. Unless you play one of those leagues where you can really build your roster depth and you can afford to keep Stephen Carr on your roster. So we'll get into that as we get to USC. But we got Oklahoma playing at Iowa State once again. Iowa State players last week match up against Iowa. Game canceled. Haven't gotten anything from David Montgomery. Haven't gotten anything from Hakeem Butler. Home matchup against Oklahoma. You're hoping to get now something out of him 3 weeks into the season, and if you don't, 1/3 of the regular season's gone and you haven't gotten anything from Iowa State. I'm still expecting a decent season from Hakeem Butler, and I still expect big things for David Montgomery. It's just going to take time for some of these guys to get going, given the situation that they have faced over the first 2 weeks of the season. Kent State playing at Penn State. I think Hamler's been a nice surprise at the receiver spot for Penn State. Miles Sanders has been solid. Trace McSorley has been really good. I don't think he's been fantasy great yet, but maybe, look, the conference games are coming. The tougher matchups are coming. The offenses are going to have to lean on McSorley more as we move into the season. I think better days ahead for Trace McSorley. Maybe it starts this weekend with an easy matchup at Kent State. We'll see how that plays out. Miami playing at Toledo. I have to tell you, if you have a Toledo player right now, Toledo went into Miami last year. They did score a bunch of points. I think Miami rolled up 41 something, 40 something on them at home. Toledo responded. Maybe they scored 3 touchdowns themselves. I do think something like that can unfold this weekend. I am more worried about Toledo this year than I was last year, just because of the new quarterback coming in. But I do think if you have Cody Thompson, I do think if you have Deontay Thompson, I think you could be okay working them into a flex spot if you need them in a pinch. I'm really worried more about Shaquille Seymour, how much production he's going to give you at the running back spot going against that Miami defense. On the flip side of that, you're looking for Travis Homer to get going if you have Miami. I think for them, Thomas has been nice. I said last week he could hit one over the top. I think he hit one over the top last week. So it'll be interesting to see what develops with that Miami offense. Let's see if the quarterback continues to be consistent, or if it's going to be if N'Kosi Perry is going to get more playing time. So there's still some things that we have to see from the Miami side as well unfold. So here we go again, 3 weeks into it, we're still waiting for developments. If is Lingard going to get more carries in the Miami offense? I actually think that he should. He looks really good when he touches the ball, and we had to wait a week because he didn't play against LSU. So those things are still going to unfold, and it's a long season, guys. I say we're going to be a third of the way in after this weekend, but other than that, some of these guys, if you remember the Jonathan Wards of the world, which we're going to touch on later on when we get to Central Michigan's game, he didn't take off to the second half of last year. Sometimes the best players to get on your roster don't bloom until the second half of the season, and they were drafted by someone that were thrown back in the waiver pool week 1, week 2, or week 3. There's going to be a bunch of those guys coming up. So don't give up on the season if you've already started off in a hole, because that waiver wire is going to save you this week and the next couple of weeks. UConn playing home against Rhode Island. Not much really to say right there, other than I like David Pindell. I think he could have a nice dual threat week for you. Maybe Kevin Mensah if you need a spot start out of a running back spot. Those would be the 2 guys that I would be looking at to fill in a roster spot if you've been kind of hurt by the Hurricanes cancellations. Would be quarterback David Pindell and running back Kevin Mensah at UConn. Hawaii playing at Army. I've had a lot of questions this week about Cole McDonald. I'm not worried about the Hawaii offense this week, but I do think they could have some problems with Army, and you kind of have to look beyond the numbers, guys. I mean, I know Hawaii hung a big number up on Navy. I just think with college, there's a big difference from playing at home and traveling all the way across country and playing on the road against a team that's going to run the ball. And if they get drives going, are going to run the clock. The possessions are going to be they're not going to get as many possessions during the game. I do think that there's a caution flag thrown up if you have a Hawaii player, but I still think McDonald's worth a start, especially in 2 quarterback leagues. I still think you got to get Ursua in there, and you have to get Cedric Byrd in your lineups. It doesn't matter who they play. They are must starts. I just don't know if you're going to get the production from them this week that you have over the first couple of weeks of the season. We've got Troy playing at Nebraska, and I think the biggest question mark is Adrian Martinez. Is he going to play? Do you have Adrian Martinez on your roster? And I think as of right now, unless there's some clarity, I think you have to make plans. I think you have to plan as if Martinez is not going to start this game. And look, take it from experience, guys. You don't want to be playing guys that have maybe only a 50% chance of playing, because you would rather get something than take a goose egg on your active roster this week. So err on the side of caution with Adrian Martinez at Nebraska. With the running back spots, I think for me the most promise from a fantasy prospect is Greg Bell. But you still got Zigbo, you still got Washington that are going to get carries. So I don't think Bell is going to be that guy that's going to turn out 200 yards and two touchdowns for you this year. I think they're going to split a lot of carries. I think really you're looking for improvement from Stanley Morgan and J.D. Spielman, who I think could have a decent game depending on how the backup quarterback plays. They should have had better numbers last week. I believe it was Morgan who dropped the touchdown pass. So should be better numbers from them moving forward as Martinez works himself back into the lineup. Florida State playing at Syracuse. Had a question today come into me, should I start Francois or should I start Hartman, the freshman quarterback at Wake? And I think given the circumstances with the weather, the uncertainty of going up against Boston College, my advice is to go with Francois in the controlled environment at Syracuse. Florida State's offense doesn't look great. I mean, last week they had problems against Samford at times. But here's the situation where you are comparing Hartman over at Wake Forest going against Boston College, possibly playing with a little wind. They're going to throw the ball quite a bit. Or do you keep it indoors and just go take your chances with Francois, controlled environment, Syracuse defense? So we'll see how that situation plays out for that fantasy owner. But I think for Syracuse, Nykeem Johnson is back in the fold. Obviously, you still have Custis there. Let's see what Eric Dungey can do against Florida State's defense. I think he's going to be okay this weekend. And I'm more interested to see what the Florida State offense is going to do at Syracuse, in particular Cam Akers, who I think for me has not looked like the Cam Akers that I was expecting. I could be wrong. It may be early. Maybe getting him in on the fast surface will make a world of a difference. A couple of weeks with Francois back leading the club. They put together a drive last week when they needed to, even though it was Samford. But I think from Francois, Nyquan Murray, I think you're just looking for some solid games. The McKitty, the tight end. But for me, my eyes are on Cam Akers. Let's see if he can really give you the game. I think many fantasy owners were expecting when they drafted him, probably as early as second and third round in some leagues. Maybe a preseason top 10 fantasy running back. You're certainly looking for 100 yards and a touchdown every single week if you drafted a guy that high. So the watch is on for Cam Akers. We go Rutgers playing at Kansas. For me, a matchup that's not really going to do much. I mentioned last week, I don't know what's going on with Steve Sims. Obviously, you had the running back Puka Williams. I don't know how reliable he can be for a second start. I'm a little hesitant to just kind of jump on board with him. I think maybe Blackshear at Rutgers, this could be a week that they lean on him playing at Kansas. But here's the problem when you have Rutgers and Kansas. You just don't know what to expect every week from those teams. So it's hard to put a lot of your fantasy stock in taking a shot with a player from a team when it's Rutgers, Kansas. So much inconsistency across the board that I'm not willing to roll the dice with a Blackshear or a Steve Sims this year. And I'd say that every single year when it comes to these type of teams. But inconsistencies are what plagues players from these teams, and then ultimately that affects your consistency from a fantasy standpoint. Ball State playing at Indiana. I think there's going to be a lot of fantasy owners that may be high on Peyton Ramsey, but I have to tell you, Penix is going to get some playing time. Sooner or later, he's going to get in there. They're going to play him. I think up until this point, I heard the coach saying the plan was to get him in the game at some point. Last week, they played Virginia. I believe it was a wet game. He didn't get in there. I do expect Penix to cut into Ramsey's numbers at some point. It may start this week in a matchup against Ball State, and I think if you have James Gilbert, given that he had respectable numbers against Notre Dame last week at Notre Dame, you get him in the lineup this week. I think you start him if you need him. Temple playing at Maryland. I tell you what a disappointment Tavon Jacobs was last week. I had him in the start piece. I don't think he had a touch on offense last week. I don't know if that was by design. I don't know if they just couldn't get him the ball, but again, Maryland, another team where sometimes you've got to worry about the consistencies, and Tavon Jacobs was example one of that last week. Murray State playing at Kentucky. What a win by the Wildcats last week. I think you're actually looking at, in a Power 5 league, Terry Wilson as an option, a dual threat option. And I think if you are in a sticky situation this week, you have to look at him as far as a plug-and-play guy. Maybe if you're even playing DFS, maybe Wilson's a guy that you look at. You know that Murray State's going to get a heavy dose of Benny Snell. The question is how much does Benny Snell play? I think he's going to get a big dose here. It's the reason why Benny Snell, I believe, is a top 5 ranking this week for us. So big week from Benny Snell. Terry Wilson, I think if you need a guy, a sleeper guy, that's your guy. And maybe if you need a sleeper receiver, maybe Lynn Bowden's your guy at wide receiver as well. He had a big play last week at Florida. Maybe his potential starting to shine through, and maybe you take a shot on him in some deep leagues as well. Tennessee playing home against UTEP. Not really much for me on the UTEP side to really discuss. I don't know if they're going to give you anything this week. Over on the Tennessee side, you've got Tim Jordan playing running back. I mentioned I like Callaway at wide receiver. He's been their most consistent threat so far after 2 games. You're probably not playing Callaway unless you're in a Power 5 only league, SEC only league, then you're starting him. But here's what I'm looking at. Is Jordan going to continue to get the heavy workload? Are we going to see a little bit of Madre London in there? Ty Chandler supposedly healthy now. Are we going to see him inserted in there? Are they going to take and steal carries away from Tim Jordan? That's my concern with Jordan. That's why I've been reluctant to go all in on Jordan. He was on our waiver wire last week, but he's a player that I'm not ready to put a whole bunch of faith in yet, just because, one, it's Tennessee, and 2, I think there's a bunch of players that could work into the mix as we move forward. So we'll have to monitor that. But if you have Jordan at this point, the matchup looks too good on paper. I think you have to play him if your matchup, considering your other matchups. Pitt playing home against Georgia Tech. And I think for me over the last week, the biggest development obviously is, other than the Kervonte Benson injury, is on the Pitt side, where it seems like Kadri Allison is now the primary back. And there was a lot of hope, given what Darren Hall did in 2017, that he was going to be the primary back for 2018. I'm telling you right now, if you need somebody that may get 20 carries this week, I'm pretty safe. I feel pretty safe assuming that Allison may be available on the waiver wire in full FBS leagues. And he could get as many as 15 to 20 carries this week playing home. I like that potential. If you need some, look, Georgia Tech gave up a ton of points last week to South Florida, so they don't exactly have a shutdown defense. So Allison could be a sleeper this week, week 3, if you need a running back that could be available in your waiver wire. And I'm assuming over on the Georgia Tech side that Mason's already gotten picked up for Kervonte Benson. But I do think, even though Taquan Marshall came out of the game last week, he was banged up. The other quarterback came in. Performed really well, but then Marshall went back in the game. So I think you're okay starting Marshall this week. I actually think he could have a good week playing at Pitt this week as well. Tulane playing at UAB. Corey Dauphine with a big week last week. And for some of you that have been playing college fantasy football now for a couple of years, maybe in keeper leagues, you know that Dauphine is the transfer that came over from Texas Tech 2 years ago. The guy's really fast, and in that system they're going to run the ball. You've got Bradwell, right? You've got Dauphine now, so you've got Hutterson. You've got 3 guys in addition to Jonathan Banks that can get touches. For the numbers that Dauphine put up last week, I don't think he had more than 10 carries. So that could be something that you see with him before you jump on him too quick. Sometimes you have to monitor the amount of carries that not only a guy gets, but the amount of carries that everybody on the team's getting. And so that's what prevents me and keeps me from jumping on Dauphine too much, is that I just think the carries are going to be spread out over at Tulane. And I think, when you look at the wide receiver position with Anclade and Mooney, Mooney had the bigger week last week. They both put up respectable numbers 2 weeks in a row, and in a road matchup against UAB, who I think got pasted by, maybe it was Coastal Carolina last week or Charlotte. I forget, it was one of those two. Right now, UAB's defense looks susceptible, so I wouldn't hesitate putting either of those 2 wide receivers in there if you need a shot at them in your full FBS leagues. Guys, I see some of the questions coming in. I'm going to scroll to those later on, so if you want to send a question in and put it in there, hopefully it'll show up at the end of the show. I'll get in there and address it when I'm done. UC Davis playing at Stanford, and here we go. Bryce Love, we're looking at a situation now where Bryce Love owners, top 5 probably fantasy pick at the preseason, and I mentioned sometimes hard luck, bad matchup week 1, weather week 2, weather now in week 3, and here we go, Bryce Love with a tough matchup against San Diego State in week 1. Stanford draws USC in week 2, which, USC's not great, but they're not a pushover. They're not UC Davis. And then all of a sudden you're licking your chops because it's like, Bryce Love is due a 200-yard game. And then we get news this week that Bryce Love won't suit up against UC Davis. So what does that mean? One, you have to wait on Bryce Love, and the big games are going to come, but you're not going to get them this week, and you haven't gotten the quote-unquote typical Bryce Love from 2017 performance yet. And then I'm a little reluctant to kind of jump on, was it Scarlett from Stanford? There's some emails coming in. Do you think he's going to have a monster game? I think Stanford. I think Scarlett's the guy to have, but I do think you've got Spates there. They could spread the wealth out a little bit. I'm reluctant on just saying that he's going to be a top 20 fantasy running back this week. I mean, Stanford should don't get me wrong. Stanford should demolish UC Davis, but Scarlett's not at Bryce Love. And Cameron Scarlett, I think I might have said Jordan Scarlett. But anyway, so that's my take on that. I do like him as a running back 2 this week, but I'd be careful about projecting him to get 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Arcega-Whiteside might be a good safe bet as well on the outside. Big week 1. Bryce Love's not there week 2. I can see them taking some shots over the top, and they're playing UC Davis. So this could be a week to get Arcega-Whiteside back into your starting rosters. Vanderbilt playing at Notre Dame, and I don't know what Brandon Wimbush is going to show up. I think right now, if you're looking at Notre Dame from a fantasy prospect, from a fantasy point of view, I think you have to start with Jafar Armstrong. I would probably say he's the only guy that I would look at in this matchup. Maybe if you had to take some type of a gamble on maybe a Miles Boykin hitting a big one over the top, but I think Jafar Armstrong is the guy that you want to have. Vanderbilt, I think this is going to be a very defensive game. I don't know if Vanderbilt's going to offer you much. Maybe Kalijah Lipscomb. I really like him as a receiver. Vanderbilt really targets him a lot. If you play in a PPR league, I mean, Lipscomb might not give you 150 yards receiving, but I do think that he's at least safe for 6 to 8 receptions in this game. They target him that much. So 6 to 8 receptions, 80 to 100 yards, maybe a touchdown in there for Lipscomb. I think he's going to be very consistent this year. He's just not going to blow the ceiling off the house. BYU playing at Wisconsin this week, and obviously after the big week 1, Squally Canada struggled last week at home against Cal. I think he'll struggle again this week playing on the road at Wisconsin. I think you put him on your bench. You've got to get Jonathan Taylor in there. This will be the best defense that Wisconsin will face in their 3 that they'll face in their 3 matchups, but it's Jonathan Taylor, and he can go for 202 touchdowns on any given week against any given opponent in that offense. You get Jonathan Taylor in your lineup, no hesitation. LSU playing at Auburn. I'm really curious to see this matchup because Brossette is the running back 1. But given the depth on your roster, I think you have to look at other matchups. I think you don't necessarily go in all in with Brossette unless you're in a Power 5 league, conference-specific league. He's the guy that I'm kind of hesitating on. And now what's going to go on with Auburn running backs? We said it was going to take 3 or 4 weeks to shake out. Whitlow had a good week last week. I've been on the Whitlow train since the preseason. I don't know if I can go Whitlow this week unless you play in a deep league. I still think we're on a wait and watch with the Auburn running backs. Maybe you take a shot with a Ryan Davis or with Auburn and playing wide receiver. I don't know. I don't know what to expect from Jarrett Stidham either. For me, this is a game where you just watch, you enjoy the physicality of it, and you kind of put your fantasy guys on the back burner. But guess what? You're saying, Joe, I can't do that. The Hurricanes affected my lineup. Well, then that's when you kind of that's when the emails come in, and I'll say, guys, I'm going to defer to the rankings. So if you've got a guy that's ranked in the top 100 of the receivers, top 100 running backs, there's nothing you can do. The weather, fortunately for some of you, have forced your hands a little bit, and you don't have the options that you would to make a bad decision on a weekly basis. So sometimes some of your hands are tied this week. So we may see a lot of fantasy lineups, active guys like Brossette, Whitlow, Ryan Davis, maybe even Jarrett Stidham in there because you just don't have the depth this week. But that's my take on the Auburn-LSU game. I'm a hold this week in fantasy potential unless you absolutely have to play them. Boise State at Oklahoma State. The games just keep getting better as I go down the list. Boise State playing at Oklahoma State. What's going on with the wide receiver? Is it Wallace? Is he the wide receiver 1 now when we had Johnson and Stoner and McCleskey pegged as 1, 2, 3, and it's Wallace at 1? I think from a fantasy standpoint, and I've been telling everybody to hold hold on to those top Oklahoma State wide receivers. This week against Boise State, for me, is going to be really telling. But if you've got Hill, Justice Hill, the running back, you get him in there. If you've got Alexander Mattison, you get him in there. Brett Rippon's playing exceptionally well. What I'm curious of is, can Sean Modster continue his hot start? Will we see a big play from an A.J. Richardson? Will Octavius Evans actually not only just suit up, but will he play? Has Boise State been really kind of err on the side of caution with him until this matchup? I really can't wait to see how this unfolds. For me, the only surefire bets in this game right now, if I'm running out there, is I definitely play Justice Hill, and I think I definitely play Alexander Mattison, given the matchups on your bench. Those are the two guys that I really like. You get Modster in there if you have to. You get Wallace in there if you need a wild card receiver. You get Tyron Johnson in there if you need a wild card at receiver. But Justice Hill and Alexander Mattison are the 1-2 guys that I'm looking at in this matchup. SMU playing at Michigan. I've got a take on SMU. I think they're horrible. I watched them. I know they played in the wet weather against TCU, but I am telling you, I was expecting more out of that offense than what I saw. It just wasn't that the weather was bad. The whole. I mean, look. I don't know. Braden West, to me, is probably the one player that's worth having on that team. After 2 games, he's probably on pace to set his career totals for maybe yards from scrimmage and scores. I think he's got 3 touchdowns already. His career high in a single season is 6. But look, they play Michigan this week, so I don't expect SMU to do anything. And I think if you have Karan Higdon, I think if you have Chris Evans, I think you can roll with both of those guys this week. I think Michigan, this is going to be one of those 40, 50 to nothing games. I'm going to be real surprised after what I saw with SMU if they even score a touchdown in this game. If I've got James Proche and I've got Reggie Roberson, the wide receiver, I feel so down in the dumps right now that I don't think you're getting anything this week. I don't know how, SMU could be 5 or 6 weeks before we even, and if I've got Ben Hicks right now, I'm looking to dump the whole SMU offense, and I hate to even sound so animated on this. They look so bad. North Texas, they looked horrible. TCU, they looked horrible. Those 2 teams are not gangbusters. Their defense is certainly not Michigan. I've spent way too much time on talking about them. I'm moving on. South Florida playing Illinois, Blake Barnett. Let's move into something positive. Making fantasy owners forget about Quentin Flowers isn't the easiest thing to do, but that's what this guy has done. Blake Barnett, I think he's totaled 8 maybe touchdowns on offense, on the ground and through the air, playing at Illinois this weekend. Illinois could be, we know they were out without Mike Dudek, who went down a couple of weeks ago. They could be without A.J. Bush this week, their starting quarterback. I think this is a real good matchup. Not great matchup, but a good matchup for South Florida to continue to roll offensively. And he is definitely a start. Get Barnett, quarterback, into your starting lineup this week for South Florida. Duke playing at Baylor. And unfortunate news with Duke. Duke's all banged up right now. Daniel Jones, the quarterback's out. Duke has actually looked good through the first couple of weeks of the season, but now I worry about them and their health and their depth going into week 3 against Baylor. And I think if you've got some Baylor guys, this could be the week to take the shot with Charlie Brewer at quarterback. You've got Mims and Hurd, who have been the most productive receivers. You've got Hasty. I think if you have those 4 guys going into this week, this is a matchup you may want to consider, even though Duke has not played, even though Duke has been playing well. This matchup to me screams Baylor all over it. Let's see if Duke can regroup here and keep it close. But I'm very optimistic about the Baylor offense this week if you've got any of the 4 guys that I've just mentioned. Lehigh playing at Navy, and look, the counter is on for how many touchdowns Zach Abey is going to steal from Malcolm Perry. It's going to be a lot this year. But this might be one of those games where he doesn't steal any. I'm going to call that this week. That'll be one of my calls this week. I'll say Malcolm Perry has 3 long-distance touchdowns, gives you 150 to 200 yards rushing, and you won't be disappointed that Zach Abey is going to steal a short yardage touchdown this week. So maybe that's my crazy call of the week. It is Lehigh. But I'm going to say Malcolm Perry, 3 long-distance touchdowns. Check in with me on email and bash me if I'm wrong on that. Central Michigan playing at Northern Illinois. A couple of players I want to touch on in this matchup in particular. Jonathan Ward, the running back for Central Michigan. Okay, so I told some guys, you've got to be a little patient with Jonathan Ward because, not just because Jonathan Ward, but for what played out last year. Jonathan Ward was one of those guys that had a tremendous second half of the season. He didn't do anything in the first half hardly, but the second half, he was just gold. But when you look to see what Central Michigan looks like on offense right now, I'm not too optimistic. I'm telling you right now, I have a lot of concerns about Jonathan Ward, and we could possibly be going into week 4 looking to drop a preseason top 20, 30 running back, depending on where he was ranked in some of the different rankings that I saw. He could be on the waiver wire after this week and could be a guy that you add to your watch list as Central Michigan gets into conference play. The other guy that I want to touch on, and it's a guy that I have in one of my leagues, one of the many leagues that I'm in, is Marcus Childers, the quarterback for Northern Illinois, who I was expecting big things from. Now, I play in a league where I've got Childers and I have Nathan Rourke, so you can understand how disappointed I've been over the first couple of weeks. Rourke had a bomber in week 1, didn't play week 2. Childers has a great matchup this week against Central Michigan, but I think he turns around next week and has another killer matchup. I forget who they play. I think they played Iowa maybe week 1, Utah last week. They get Central Michigan this week, and I think he's got another tough matchup next week. So if you have Marcus Childers, check the schedule on him. But something tells me if he doesn't perform well, that could be a guy that hits the waiver wire that you might want to snag up in a couple of weeks after his tough matchups are behind him in the rearview mirror. But right now, if you have him on your roster, this is probably the best matchup you're going to get for the first 4 weeks of the season, and I think you go ahead and start him. Miami of Ohio playing at Minnesota. Obviously, we had Rodney Smith go down last week, and I think the interesting thing for me over at Minnesota is, we had, excuse me, the freshman come in and get 20 carries, but the tight end actually vultured a couple of touchdowns. So I'm curious to see if that situation plays out where maybe they trust the big guy around the goal line. Is it because the freshman didn't have a lot of experience? I don't know, but let's monitor what's going to move, what to expect to see what's going to happen with that Minnesota offense in the running game as we move forward. Now, with Miami of Ohio, I also saw their game against Cincinnati as well, and they played in the rainstorm. James Gardner was probably targeted 15 times. I think he only had 7 or 8 receptions, but the weather was wet. I think if you have Gardner, I think his best days are coming. I'm not looking for Gus Ragland on any fantasy rosters, but I do think James Gardner, as the Redhawks get into conference play, you're going to get bigger numbers from him. I was really encouraged to watch that game and see how they were targeting him last week. But the weather, it was just unfortunate. It was just a bad weather game, guys. And Cincinnati's defense is no joke. Matter of fact, on this show last week, I gave you Cincinnati as the lock to go make a bet on them, and they hit twice for me big last week, made money on Cincinnati. I really think moving forward, Cincinnati and the unders, if you guys out there bet, are going to be a good play for you moving forward with their defense and the way that they run the ball. I think they're going to be a surprise this year. UTSA playing at Kansas State. The only thing I'm looking at right now, real quite and simple on this game before I move on, is Alex Barnes. If you have Alex Barnes at running back, he's really the only guy. Maybe you take a stab with an Isaiah Zuber at wide receiver. But for me, I need to see a little consistency before, and look, the consistency out of the quarterback position too. Alex Barnes, for me, is really the only fantasy option in this offense for Kansas State at this point. Over at Wyoming, and guys, you have to forgive me because I had the name before I came on and I forgot. The player that replaced Nico Evans, if any of you all have his name out there, Bigelow, I think it might be his name. I'm not sure. I think that's it. I can see him having a decent game this week. He would be a guy, hopefully many of you all that have Nico Evans, or some of you all that needed a spot fill running back for this week, went ahead and picked him up. I think he could be a good play this week for Wyoming home against Wofford, and also the Wyoming defense, a solid play this week as well. Eastern Kentucky playing at Bowling Green. The only thing I'm interested to see here is Scott Miller. Is he injured? Will he play? I don't know. That's something that we're going to have to monitor. You should monitor as we get up to kickoff. I think his potential in this week's matchup is great. But now, if he's a 50-50 injury risk, I don't even think he's going to end up in many active rosters for the fear of getting a goose egg. But if you have Andrew Clare this week, this is the week you want to definitely start getting him into your roster. I feel a big week. Andrew Clare, the running back, Bowling Green playing home against Eastern Kentucky. Colorado State playing at Florida. And I have to tell you right now, after watching Preston Williams at home against Arkansas, and I know Florida's at home this week, but they were also at home against Kentucky last week too. And Lynn Bowden went over the defense and got past the defense for one. Florida doesn't look great right now. So you look up the matchup on paper. Maybe at the beginning of the season you said Colorado State at Florida week 3. Depending on what I think about Preston Williams and how good I think he's going to be, I don't think he's going to start this game anyway. Preston Williams has to be in your lineup. The guy has been absolute gold this year. I continue to see him being absolute gold this year. So Preston Williams is a start. He's not on the start bench, but I'm telling you right now, Preston Williams is a start week 3 at Florida. North Texas playing at Arkansas, and for me, this is a real interesting matchup. The line is only about 6.5 points. North Texas playing on the road at Arkansas, SEC team. Chad Morris taking over the reins. Arkansas blew a huge lead last week at Colorado State. This North Texas team is sneaky good. I think Rico, somebody sent me a question and they had my, I'm forgetting the lead receiver off of North Texas. Guy that got so many names in my head right now, but Rico Bussey was still on the waiver wire. And he already had the North Texas top wide receiver on there, Jalen Guyton. I told him to pick him up. I mean, look, here's the question. If Bussey's out there and you already have Guyton, wait till they get into conference play and you've got 2 studs. Because here's the question that you have to ask yourself. What if you could have Gary Jennings and David Sills on your team? Would you take both of those guys? I mean, I would. Give me those 2 guys in a full wide receiver 2 flex league. I'm starting them every week. That's how I feel with Bussey and Guyton. If you've got Guyton and you've got a chance to get Rico Bussey as well, get them both on your roster. I think for me, what I'm looking at is it seems to be that DeAndre Torrey, I believe his name, is maybe the guy that emerges at running back that takes over the role that Jeffrey Wilson had last year that we thought Nick Smith would get moving into the season. I like to tell you what I do because I think it offers a little bit more insight. I went ahead and picked up DeAndre Torrey in a couple of my leagues where I can get him, where he was available. I have to take a chance on that guy moving forward, and if he's available and you need a running back, I'm telling you, take a shot on him right now as North Texas get into conference play. If he emerges as the number 1 option, he's going to be gold in that offense. Mason Fine, too. I don't know if Mason Fine, you have to consider your lineup, your matchups this week, but if you need Mason Fine, I wouldn't shy away. I can see North Texas throwing for 300 yards and 2 or 3 touchdowns on the road, even at Arkansas. So if you're faced with the prospects of sitting or starting Mason Fine, I say you pull the trigger on the guy. Arkansas couldn't shut down Colorado State. Why is there any reason to believe that they're going to shut down North Texas? So that's my take on the North Texas offense for this week playing at Arkansas. And if you've got Devwa Whaley at Arkansas, I think you roll him in your lineups too as well. Houston playing at Texas Tech. I think you put Bowman in there. You put Vasher in there. Maybe DeLeon Ward plays this week. If Bowman's the quarterback, I think you start him. This is an all-hands-on-deck game for fantasy prospects. You've got Derek King over at the quarterback spot. You get him in your lineup. I think Marquez Stevenson is the wide receiver to own for Houston. He's in my lineup. Courtney Lark, I have him in one of my leagues. I think you put him in your lineup as well. So all of those guys, I think you put into your lineup. You put Bowman, you put Vasher, Ward if he starts. You've got Bowman, the quarterback for Tech. You've got King. You've got Stevenson. You've got Courtney Lark. All those guys, maybe even Keith Corbin, the wide receiver at Houston. All those guys, this is a game that's over-under is about 70 as long as the weather's good. I think that number is going to be pushed. So they're going to get close to there. You may see as many as 12 to 15 touchdowns in this game, guys, and I get all you players in your lineup this week. Ohio playing at Virginia, real interesting matchup for me, and a tidbit that I'll offer up on quarterback Bryce Perkins, who many of you all know in emails, listening to the show, a lot of the stuff that we publish or I have published on the site. I love Bryce Perkins and Olamide Zaccheaus this year, but Bryce Perkins for me right now is a must own. I saw an article this past week where one of the reporters, one of the beat writers, one of the journalists asked Bronco Mendenhall about Perkins carrying the ball 20 times a game. And Mendenhall's quote, I believe, without, I don't know if I'm hitting the nail on the head, was, "That sounds about right. He's done a real good job of not taking clean hits." For me, that tells me that offense is going strictly through Bryce Perkins. Now, I grabbed a lot of Bryce Perkins this year. I have Bryce Perkins in a ton of leagues. But if Bryce Perkins is out there, guys, he should not be on the waiver wire. And I'm telling you right now, take a break from the show for 2 minutes and come back. Go scoop up Bryce Perkins off your waiver wire and then come back and listen to it, because getting Bryce Perkins is worth more than listening to this show for the next 5 minutes. So that's my take on him. But we also need to know Nathan Rourke, and I own him in one of my leagues. He was pulled in that first game, I think it was against Howard, and didn't come back in. Quentin Maxwell was given the reins from that point on, and they needed Quentin Maxwell to play well because Ohio barely pulled out that game. But with Rourke going to the bench and Ohio not playing in week 2, if you own Rourke, you've got nothing from him for 2 weeks. Then you're going into week 3 and saying, is he going to play? Am I going to get anything from him? All of a sudden, I'm stuck with a big question mark on what to do with Nathan Rourke. And I have to tell you, you have to roll the dice with Nathan Rourke. The greatest thing to come out of the bye week for Ohio this week is the fact that Frank Solich has said Nathan Rourke is our starting quarterback. We may be 5 weeks into the season, and this doesn't even matter. I think Nathan Rourke is obviously the guy. I don't know if there was just a point that was trying to be made, but I think if you have Nathan Rourke, this is an okay matchup to get him back into your lineups and have some faith in Nathan Rourke. And I think he starts showing up on our fantasy radar after this weekend against Virginia. San Jose State playing at Oregon. Actually, if you need a sleep receiver, let me go back to that Ohio-Virginia game. Poppy White, if you have a chance, if you need somebody to plug and play this week, he may be worth it. He may be worth a grab. San Jose State playing at Oregon. Nothing from the San Jose State side from me. Oregon, for me, it's all about Justin Herbert. I think you're looking at receivers over there where maybe a couple of them are going to get 2 or 3 catches. I don't think anybody's really going to tear it up from a receiver standpoint. I think if you've got Tony Brooks-James, you get him in your lineup. If you've got C.J. Verdell, you possibly get him in and hope he can find the end zone for you. I think both of those guys will get a majority of the carries in that offense. And so I think the stock for me lies in maybe Justin Herbert tremendously. Tony Brooks-James get in there. C.J. Verdell's got to be given consideration. I think if you've got maybe Mitchell, you've got Red, one of the wide receivers, Kano, the tight end. I think you give all those guys consideration based on what you have on your bench this week. New Hampshire playing at Colorado, and for me, there's been no better receiver in the country than Laviska Shenault. He was getting all the hype in the spring, all the hype in the fall, and he has proved all the hype right. You have him, you get him in your lineup. And listen, I don't think guys like Katie Nixon, I don't think guys like Jay McIntyre are bad plays either. I think Steven Montez is definitely worth a start this week. The only thing that's come out of Colorado for me that's made me hit the pause button is just what's going on at the running back spot. Obviously, it's McMillan and it's Evans. They're splitting carries, but that Colorado offense is doing so well through the air that I think you stick with the kicker. I mean, you stick with the quarterback and you stick with the receivers, and that's my take on the Colorado offense. Idaho State playing at Cal. It was nice to see Noah, the wide receiver, Kanawai Noah, I think is his name. And forgive me, guys. I mean, I miss and butcher some of these names, but that's not the fun part. The fun part's just winning games with them in your starting lineup anyway. But Noah, it was nice to see him get similar numbers that he had for a lot of you fantasy owners last year in 2017. I'm still waiting for Vic Wharton. I don't know if he's going to show up this year, but we do know that Mr. Reliable has been Patrick Laird. I said on the last week's show that it was going to be a showdown from a fantasy standpoint, that we were watching Laird and we were watching Squally Canada, and Cal went in there, won at BYU, and Patrick Laird is a must-start every week regardless of opponent. Get him in. Bethune-Cookman playing at Florida Atlantic this week. And, I've got a real interesting take about Florida Atlantic. They're not just Devin Singletary this year. That offense is, I believe, is way better than it was last year. I mean, you've got Robeson, the former Oklahoma quarterback. He's got 3 targets that he's throwing the ball to. He's got Javon Durant, the former West Virginia receiver. He's got Willie Wright, who I believe was the team's leading receiver last year, and he's got Tavares Harrison is the name that I almost forgot, and I made sure I write that down. I think Willie Wright and I think Javon Durant are on rosters right now, but I'm telling you right now, if you need a sneaky play, a guy that never made the waiver wire, a guy that I kind of find later on in the week, if there are some guys in your league that are not onto him right now, check out Tavares Harrison. Here's the one thing that I think. Devin Singletary is still going to have a really good year, but I think the passing game may dent into his fantasy value a little bit, especially a lot compared to last year. So I think that FAU's passing game is 10 times better than they were a year ago. And it's going to affect Singletary, but Singletary is still a must-start every single week. I just don't see him making a run at the single-season touchdown record as he did last year. Eastern Michigan playing at Buffalo. Obviously, Eastern Michigan with a shocker win playing at Purdue. It's just one of those games. I think Purdue made some bonehead plays down the stretch, gave Eastern Michigan every opportunity to stay in the game, and they took advantage of it. One name that I'm looking at Eastern Michigan, and it's probably not showing up on a lot of guys' radars. I believe we may have included him on the waiver wire, maybe not. Maybe he went out in my exclusive email. Is Blake Banham, the former running back, converted running back. Now he's receiver. He's their leading receiver. I think he's a name to watch out for this week. He could be a sleeper pick for you guys playing DFS. Guys looking for a sleeper receiver, Blake Banham, Eastern Michigan wide receiver. And over at Buffalo, I think you have Kevin Parks. Kevin Marks was I think he's a redshirt freshman. Leading running back last week for Buffalo. I think he probably gets the call again this week. I think Eastern Michigan's a little tougher matchup than what some people believe they are. I think this is going to be a close game, but it'll be interesting to see if Marks gets a lot of work moving forward as the Bulls lead back, as Buffalo gets into conference play. Alabama playing at Ole Miss, and I tell you right now, I say this every year, it's never a good thing to start a player against the Alabama defense, and I'm looking at Ole Miss thinking to myself, I think Alabama over the years has been susceptible to the pass. I think if you have Scotty Phillips, you're maybe not, depending on your matchups, but A.J. Brown, I think he's got to be in. If DeMarcus Lodge plays, I think you might want to take a shot with him, maybe DK Metcalf. I love that Alabama offense. I said it last week, Jerry Jeudy was worth having. I actually had a lot of stock in the preseason. I said Najee Harris and Whitlow were two of my wild cards that I was looking to emerge from really two teams. Najee Harris led the Alabama offense in rushing last week. Let's see if he continues that moving forward. I know not the greatest news that you want to hear if you're a Damian Harris fantasy owner, but I do think Najee Harris is the best running back on that team, and I think he could have a big game this week. I think Tua Tagovailoa is going to have a big game. I think Judy's going to have a big game. I think if you've got Ruggs, you probably get him in there. Smith. I mean, Power 5 leagues, you're playing a lot of the offensive guys in this matchup. I do think Alabama is going to score a ton of points, but I do think Ole Miss is going to score some points too. I don't think they'll be shut out. As a matter of fact, I will be surprised. For me, the biggest question marks on Ole Miss is, do you start Scotty Phillips and do you start Jordan Ta'amu? I think you've got A.J. Brown, you put him in. I think the rest of the guys are the question marks. You have to evaluate. You have to look at your rosters and say, hey, can I live with a 20 to 25 point performance from Ta'amu this week as a quarterback too? And that's only a decision you can make given your roster, guys. So hope that insight just kind of helps you a little bit with my thought process on trying to identify that quarterback too for the week. Maybe that third wide receiver, maybe that flex. Texas State playing at South Alabama. The only thing that I'm seeing over at the South Alabama is the wide receiver, and forgive me because I've got tons of names going through me. I wrote down guys, but I'm going to pull it up real quick. I don't want to forget any of these guys because some of you all may not have caught them on the waiver wires, but some of you guys have. Baker, I think is his name. Kawan Baker. Right, if you look at him, he's got I think like 5 touchdowns already. He's only got like 19 touches. He's the creative playmaker in their offense. I think this could be a good matchup for him. Whether or not he gets a lot of touches is another question. I'm a high volume guy. I like the guys that get 8 to 10 receptions. I know all of you do too. But the A.J. Dillons, the 20 to 25 carries a game. You give me a guy that's only going to get 4 to 5 touches a game, and you're kind of banking that he takes one of those to the house. That's asking a lot. However, if it is a flex position, if it is a third wide receiver spot, then Kawan Baker is definitely somebody that you can want to take a look at this week in a matchup against Texas State. Western Michigan playing Delaware State. A lot of questions coming in about that Western Michigan offense. I think Levante Bellamy is going to be the guy. I think he's the best running back on the team. He can do it. He can catch the ball out of the backfield. I think this actually can be a really big game for Levante Bellamy. And in regards to Dwayne Eskridge, real big week 1 matchup against Syracuse. He didn't do anything last week against Michigan, and I get that. I understand that. It was Michigan, guys, so we weren't really expecting that. But if Eskridge's week 1 performance wasn't an anomaly, then he will probably be worth getting in your rosters this week. I think you roll with Eskridge. I think you take a chance on him. If he doesn't give you anything this week, then maybe we look back on week 1 and say, you know what? That's not who I'm going to get going forward. I've had 3 chances with him and only 1 has paid off. So that's a guy that I'm monitoring moving into week 3 and beyond. Tulsa playing home against Arkansas State, another offensive game here. Tulsa took Texas to the wire last week, and I think if you have Shamari Brooks, you have to feel really good. I think Shamari Brooks has top 10 fantasy potential running back-wise. He could finish as one of the top 10 fantasy running backs at the end of the year. We know how that Tulsa offense operates. We know that Shamari Brooks is going to get a ton of carries, 20, 25, and I would venture to say maybe even 30 in some weeks. Playing against an Arkansas State offense that we know are going to score points. I expect a lot of points in this game. Obviously, if you've got maybe even Justin McGinnis, the wide receiver at Arkansas State, you stick him in there. But Justice Hansen, quarterback Arkansas State, is a must start. So that'll be a lot of points in this game. Cincinnati playing home against Alabama A&M, and I have to tell you, I have been impressed with Michael Warren, the running back. The question for me is this. I'm a little concerned on how much Warren is actually going to play this week. We'll see. I think the scoreboard will actually dictate how much work he gets. He got a lot of carries in that first game against UCLA. I think he topped the 30 mark. Last week he was needed because of the wet game they had. Miami of Ohio was a defensive struggle. They really needed somebody in there to take care of the ball. The game went on. The longer the game went on, the stronger he got. He scored 2, I believe it was 2 touchdowns in that game. I'll be curious the game against Alabama A&M. If Warren doesn't get his points early, do they give him a lot of rotation? Do they give him some rest? Because they're certainly going to need him as they get into conference play. Nevada playing home against Oregon State, and I think if you're Nevada, obviously you've got McLean Maddox, you get him in your lineup. You've got Ty Ganji, you get him in your lineup. I don't know about Kelton Moore right now. Kelton Moore, Jackson Kincaid. I don't know about Nevada running back if I'm taking a chance on them this week. The 2 guys for Nevada I'm probably taking chances on this week are Caleb Fossum, who's been fairly productive through 2 weeks, and Brendan O'Leary Orange, who did return last week and only caught 1 pass. It was a touchdown on the road at Vanderbilt. You look at the numbers and you say they weren't great, but you know what? Vanderbilt was one of those teams that I had my money riding on against with the spread last week because I just felt that confident after watching Vanderbilt against Middle Tennessee that Vanderbilt was going to be able to handle Nevada. So I do think if you have Caleb Fossum, if you do have Brendan O'Leary Orange, better days are ahead for you with those guys. But McLean Maddox to me is clear-cut number 1, Ty Ganji's top target. So that's who I'm getting in there. On the Oregon State side, is Trevon Bradford going to play, the wide receiver? Don't know. He got a nick last week, but we do know that Artavis Pierce definitely will not play with an elbow injury, and I think it's Jaffer Jefferson came in and just blew up. I think went for 200 yards and 4 touchdowns, if I remember correctly. And here's the thing. I always tell guys not to knee-jerk on taking guys out and never knee-jerk on putting somebody in, but when you look at a guy that had a performance like that, and then you see the matchup this week, it has to be worth a roll of the dice that you're going to get something maybe close to that. I would think if you have Jefferson, you've got to take a chance on him this week because the Oregon State running backs have been golden so far. in college fantasy football. So get Jefferson in your lineup this week. Mississippi State playing home against Louisiana. Obviously, Kylan Hill had a talk with a friend of mine this week. If you had to do the Power 5 draft, if you were in a Power 5 league only doing the draft all over again, who are your top 3 picks? And Kylan Hill would be a top 3 pick. The guy's just an absolute stud. There will be hiccups on the road. There will be games against Auburn. There will be games against Alabama. But if the history of Joe Moorhead's offense is any indication, Hill is going to get a lot of touches, guys, in that offense, and he has potential to finish as one of the top Power 5 backs, maybe even challenge Jonathan Taylor in regards to numbers by the end of the season. So I'm really curious to see his development. Over if you got a ULL player, a Louisiana player, Trey Regis, I don't know if he's going to be worth a start. The running back, maybe if you have a Jamarcus Bradley, the wide receiver spot, you might take a look at him as a flex option in your full FBS leagues. But other than that, I'd probably stay away from Louisiana this week. Northern Iowa playing at Iowa this week. Torin Young's going to get some carries this week. There's no doubt about that. Torin Young, I think it's Torin Young, and let me get the other guy's name, because I do think there's going to be some split carries going on at Iowa this week, because obviously Ivory Kelly Martin is still a question mark. So it's I think it's Mekhi Sargent. Sargent is the last name. I think if you're looking for somebody and you're in a Power 5 league and you need to fill a gap because of the cancellations, Sargent may be the guy, maybe as a running back too, this week over at Iowa, because you know what? They play Northern Iowa. I would have figured that the Hawkeyes would probably, who knows, maybe they won't. But this game, probably they lean on their running backs, and I would think that Young and Sargent get a lot of work if Kelly Martin's going to be out this week. So those are 2 names to throw at you this week. Louisville playing host to Western Kentucky, and let me just put the paper down again because here I go. First of all, Western Kentucky, if you're going to take a stab with somebody, probably going to be Lucky Jackson. I'll stop there at Western Kentucky, but over at Louisville, Juwan Pass. And I talked about how I couldn't wait for Juwan Pass to get into conference play. You know, he threw for 270, 2 touchdowns against Alabama. I know it was mop-up time, but I felt so good about Juwan Pass. And then all of a sudden, he gets pulled last week. You know, bad weather, and you chalk it up to bad weather, and you're like, okay, maybe bad weather, but it's like he still got pulled. And then you find out this week that he's got turf toe. And then you kind of look at the situation, and you say, okay, turf toe, that could be an aggravating injury. Is he really going to be the dual threat that I thought he was going to be? Now, don't get me wrong. He was never going to be Lamar Jackson. But he was going to be dual threat. Now, if he's got turf toe, he becomes a little bit more one-dimensional. So I'm concerned about that. 2, how bad is the injury and how much will it aggravate him? Because turf toe can get serious to the point where you can miss 2-4 weeks and maybe even require surgery if it gets too bad. So all of a sudden, I'm looking at all my shares of Juwan Pass stock, and I'm thinking to myself, I got in over my head. This is what I think. This week will tell us what we're looking at with Juwan Pass moving forward. I can see Louisville scoring a lot of points this week. I can see Juwan Pass playing and Louisville running up the score. I'm hoping he's healthy. I'm praying he's healthy. I've got everything in my bones that want me to believe that he's going to be healthy. But this could be a make-or-break week for Juwan Pass on your roster this week. And so all eyes for me, a lot of eyes, a lot of my attention will be on Louisville this week at home against Western Kentucky. Missouri playing at Purdue. Drew Lock, Emmanuel Hall have been solid. I think this could be a week you see a little bit of dip in their numbers. I still think their starts. I still think you get them in there. Purdue has been very disappointing. The guy that I'm really a little hesitant on this week is Rondale Moore. After a big week 1, do you really put him in week 3 against Missouri after another ho-hum week? I'm willing to take a pass on Rondale Moore right now. I think if you have him, especially in keeper leagues, dynasty leagues, you feel good because he's a freshman. But I don't necessarily think he's in your active roster this week at home against Missouri. Louisiana Monroe playing at Texas A&M. I think if you've got Caleb Evans, the quarterback at Louisiana Monroe, you at least consider him this week. I think you do have to consider Marcus Green, the wide receiver, as well. But Travion Williams, I think this is going to be a big Travion Williams week. I'm a little hesitant to fall into the trap of Kellen Mond looking so good against Clemson that he's going to be a fantasy juggernaut this week against UL Monroe. I actually think A&M will go back more towards back to the running game a little bit and lean on Travion Williams. But I do think Mond will get his numbers because Louisiana Monroe, they're just that bad. So I think if you have an Osborne, you kind of get him in your lineup. You have Sternberger, the tight end, you get him in your lineup this week. Florida International playing home against UMass. The one player that I really love this way, first of all, I do like C.J. Wharton as a surprise receiver over at FIU. So if you're looking at DFS, deep sleeper league, a deep sleeper in a deep FBS league, C.J. Wharton may be your guy, wide receiver at FIU. Put him on your watch list. And I do think Andy Isabella has a big week for UMass. He was projected top 10 preseason fantasy receiver, and I do think he gives you a top 10, top 15 performance this week on the road at FIU. Akron playing at Northwestern, and for me, there's only two players I'm really looking at in this matchup. Obviously, Jeremy Larkin, one, the running back at Northwestern, and two, Flynn Nagel, the wide receiver at Northwestern. He's obviously their top target after 2 weeks. The only thing that I look at the stat sheet and I say Northwestern hasn't thrown a touchdown pass yet this year. But I do think, especially PPR league, you get them in your rosters this week, and those are the two guys that I'm looking at in this particular game. Ohio State playing at TCU, and I'm going to go on a little bit and look at Sean Robinson from TCU, who had a really good week 1. Last week played against SMU, and there were moments where I looked at Sean Robinson and I was like, oh, he's going to be really good. And then there were other times where I looked at him and I was like, I'm just going to have my concerns. I think that could be the story with Robinson. I think we're going to have some really good games. We're going to have some okay games. I actually came away with the feeling that Jalen Reagor could have a really big year for TCU at the wide receiver spot if Robinson can get him the ball. So if you have Jalen Reagor or he's available, I think he's a player that you may want to put on your roster. The only thing is that I don't know what's going to happen with the TCU running back situation. It looks like a committee approach this year where Darius Anderson got most of the carries at the beginning of last year. I do think that you're looking at a committee approach by TCU in the TCU backfield this year and Ohio State. Here's the one thing we're going to know with Ohio State. Dwayne Haskins has looked as good as any quarterback in the country slinging the ball around. For me, this is what's going to happen with the Ohio State offense. I think you want to own Dwayne Haskins for sure. At the wide receiver spot, whether you own McLaurin, whether you own Paris Campbell, you're going to get a receiver that's probably going to get 2 to 4 catches a game. You're going to have to hope for a touchdown, but a ceiling for an Ohio State receiver this year may just be for 101, and you live with it, and it rotates, by the guy. And speaking of rotation, I think that's what you're going to get at Ohio State. You've got Mike Weber at running back. You've also got J.K. Dobbins. I think at any one particular week, they're just going to ride the hot hand. It could be Weber one week that goes for 150 and 2 touchdowns. It could be he might do that for 2 weeks in a row, and then all of a sudden Dobbins is going to be the guy to go for 130 and 3 touchdowns. I think you're just going to have to live with the headache if you own one of those two. But I don't know how you sit either one of them. Here's my advice for those players. If you own a J.K. Dobbins or Mike Weber, I love consistency. I would rather somebody that has a little bit lower ceiling, that's going to be a little bit more consistent, than somebody that may give me more, a bigger game, but give them to me less frequently. And you know what I like to do with those guys? I wait for them to have one big game, and I like to package them in a trade. That's what I like to do. Just throwing that out there. New Mexico playing at New Mexico State. The only player I'm looking at, and I don't know if Jason Huntley is going to have a reemergence because New Mexico State finally plays a weaker defense, but I do think if you have Tyrone Owens, the running back of New Mexico, you get him in your lineups this week. New Mexico lost their starting quarterback to a concussion. I think their offense will go through Tyrone Owens this week in a road matchup at New Mexico State. Eastern Washington playing at Washington State. And obviously, you've got Gardner Minshew, who's up there at the top of our quarterback rankings. You've got James Washington. I think if you've got Max Borgi, the freshman running back, you could take a shot on him this week playing Eastern Washington. You've obviously got Devontavian Martin, the wide receiver. I think if you've got Jameer Calvin, you get him in your lineup as well. So I do think you've got about 4 or 5 plays for Washington State this week in a home matchup against Eastern Washington. Washington at Utah. This game's going to go a long ways to determining the Pac-12. This is going to determine, in many ways, that Pac-12, the divisional race over there. I actually thought that Utah, for me, was my sleeper Pac-12 team going into the year. I have every reason to believe that Utah could win it and emerge out of this, escape this game at home with a win. But I do think that if you have, if you have Zach Moss, I think he's in your lineup. If you have Myles Gaskin, he's in your lineup this week. If you want to take a shot on one of the receivers, maybe Britton Covey, maybe Ty Jones, maybe Aaron Fuller, maybe you stick those guys in there. But right now, I don't even know if I'm touching this game with any fantasy players right now, unless I'm in a Power 5 league. But if I'm in a full FBS, I'm looking at Zach Moss. I'm looking at Myles Gaskin, and those are the two names that really, for me, it's kind of like the BYU Cal game last week. I'm looking at the running backs. Maybe you take a shot on Tyler Huntley in a 2-quarterback league, but for me, it comes down to Myles Gaskin and Zach Moss. UNLV playing home against Prairie View, and for me, I think what you're looking at is a heavy dose of Lexington Thomas. I think Armani Rogers could be a sleeper quarterback this week, and I'm going to give you another name, guys. Sorry I didn't have all these written down, but Darren Woods, the wide receiver over at UNLV. I believe he missed the first game of the year last week, but is it Woods? Yeah, Darren Woods last week caught 3 balls, 51 yards, and a touchdown. I do think he's going to end up being their top receiver before the year is over with, and he could be a sleeper in a full FBS, deep FBS league. Darren Woods, the wide receiver, UNLV. Arizona State playing at San Diego State, and here, this is going to be a tough game for not only Eno Benjamin on the road for Arizona State, but I think it's going to be a tough game for Juwan Washington. Arizona State did a really good job against that Michigan State offense last week. However, San Diego State and Juwan Washington was still able to top the 100-yard mark on the road against Stanford in week 1. There's no way in the world I'm sitting Juwan Washington ever unless he's playing with a cast on his leg. He's starting every week. Eno Benjamin, I would still say he's a start this week, even though they're on the road at San Diego State. But here's where I'll kind of offer this and why I think he's a start. For me, he's a start in PPR leagues. I think he had 7 receptions last week against Michigan State. If you're playing in a PPR league, then Eno Benjamin probably should be in your lineup. But if you're not in a PPR league and you're based solely on yards and rushing and touchdowns, then Benjamin's probably a sit this week. The guy that I'm really impressed with, and I mean, it's hard not to be impressed because he just looks like a freak, is N'Keal Harry. Now, keep this in mind. J.J. Arcega-Whiteside tore up that San Diego State secondary in week 1. I think N'Keal Harry has potential to do that in week 2. He's a guy that I really like this week. I'd feel encouraged if you have N'Keal Harry. As long as Wilkins can get the ball to him, I think he's going to be a solid wide receiver this week in week 3. Then, well, let's see, just a couple more games left. Fresno State playing at UCLA. I still think if you have Bolu, you put him in there at running back. I don't know if they get Jamabo back this week. I don't know if he'll be part of the game plan. I think Dorian Thompson-Robinson still probably locked in at the quarterback. I don't really have a lot of confidence in him from a fantasy standpoint right now going against a respectable Fresno State defense. But I do think if you have to run Bolu out there in your active rosters, maybe he's got potential to give you a couple of touchdowns, even though you may not get a bunch of yards. I think you roll with Caleb Wilson, the tight end over at UCLA. And I don't really know if you're really going with many guys over at Fresno State this week. McMarion, the quarterback. Keyshawn Johnson, you are. I take that back. If you have Keyshawn Johnson, you are starting him. I forgot we've got him pretty high in the rankings this week. And then the final game before I get into the start bench, Southern Utah playing at Utah. And, I do have Khalil Tate in the start bench list. So I'll kind of save my thunder for him. But I do think JJ Wilson, is it JJ Taylor, the running back? I think you get him in your lineup this week. Good matchup against Southern Utah. And I think Sean Poindexter has been a really nice fantasy find. If you don't have him on your rosters right now, particularly if you play in a Power 5 only league, you have to get Sean Poindexter on your roster, the Arizona State wide receiver. So that kind of gives you the game breakdown. There was probably a good 6, 7, 8 games that got canceled this week. But, guys, I'm going to go right into my start bench. And let me see if I got that pulled up right here, because I know I have the start bench ready to rock and roll for you guys. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll get some of the questions on here before I go into the start bench. Let me see if I can knock these out. Jump on a good head. I'll be honest later tonight. Should I start Mond from A&M or Perkins from UVA? I was leaning towards Mond, and you rank Perkins higher. I'm all over Perkins. Power 5 only league, and I have Sternberger at tight end, which is why I was leaning towards Mond. Appreciate the show and all your answers. Hey, look, thanks for the compliment. Even though, look, just because you have Mond and Sternberger doesn't mean that you have to lean on both of them. It's okay to start one without the other. I mean, what if Mond only throws one touchdown and it is to Sternberger? I mean, there are a lot of scenarios tonight where I threw out names of wide receivers and also mentioned that I don't know if I would take there and start their quarterback. So that's something. I mean, look, you even look at the Toledo situation with Guadagni at quarterback. But I think if you have Deontay Johnson and Deontay Johnson and Cody Thompson, you possibly start both of those guys without even starting their quarterback. So a bunch of those scenarios up and down the lineup. Zach Moss, David Montgomery, Kylan Hill. Which two of those do I start? I would probably go Kylan Hill, and it's Zach Moss at home or Montgomery home against Oklahoma, and I am going to say go with Montgomery, especially if you play in a PPR league. I can see Montgomery finally getting off and out of the gate. Montgomery and Hill is an every week starter except Alabama, so yeah, there you go. Montgomery it is. So here we go, guys. I'm going to go through some of the start bench stuff, and I didn't print any of this stuff out. This will be straight up on the website after we get off, and I am going to go straight into this week's bench list, and I like to save the starts for last. Hopefully I'll hit you guys with some thunder and lightning this week. We did good on the bench week last week, I think, and the start was kind of 50-50. So I'm going to look no farther than that Louisville matchup, Juwan Pass, and I told you guys how excited I was at the beginning of the year for Juwan Pass, but like I said, he threw for 250, a couple of touchdowns against Alabama in the opener. I was expecting a big season from him, and he was pulled in the third quarter. We find out he's got, was it the bad weather? Was it turf toe? That could linger for weeks, guys. And for me, I have to take a wait-and-see approach, even though I hate to do that with one of my top quarterbacks. But for me, Juwan Pass is a Week 3 bench this week, even at home against Western Kentucky, where he's got a lot of potential to put up some big numbers. Braden West, the running back SMU, I said he was on a career pace this year after 2 games. He's totaled over 200 yards in those 2 games. He's scored 3 touchdowns. He's already scored he's actually scored more touchdowns this season already than he did in all of 2017. He could top his career high. I mentioned earlier on the show, his career high for touchdowns in a season is 6, but this week the Mustangs travel to Michigan. They face a Wolverines defense that only allowed 208 total yards of offense to Western Michigan last week. And for me, Braden West, running back, SMU, hit rewind and go back to what I had to say about SMU earlier on the show. Braden West is a Week 3 bench. Squally Canada, running back BYU, playing at Wisconsin. He ran for 96 yards, 3 touchdowns in their Week 1 win. But he struggled last week. 21-18 lost to Cal. He only ran for 49 yards. He had 16 carries, and I do expect them to struggle against a traditional defensive power this week, playing on the road at Wisconsin. And I think you leave Squally Canada, running back BYU, on your bench this week. Jonathan Ward, I mentioned this early on the show. Jonathan Ward last year, he ran for over 1,000 yards. He had a killer second half. He ran for over 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns. He even caught 48 passes last year for 470 yards and 3 touchdowns. But after 2 games this year, he's only totaled 65 rushing yards. He's only caught 1 pass this year. He had 48 last year. A road trip to Northern Illinois in week 3. For me, the matchup's just not there given what I've seen out of him. I think if Ward struggles this week, fantasy owners may wait one more week and see how he plays against Maine in week 4 before cutting bait. But for me, I'm going to see what we get out of Ward this week, and I think you have to wait and watch, and he may not even make it to that Maine game on a lot of fantasy owners' rosters. So for me, Jonathan Ward, running back, Central Michigan at NIU, is a week 3 bench. Ty Lee, wide receiver, Middle Tennessee, and I know it's not what you want to hear, Ty Lee owners, but I warned you guys last week the matchup just isn't there. The matchup was there last week. That was the game you were waiting for, and he didn't give you much. And you know what? A lot of his owners are going to be reluctant to drop him because of his fantasy potential when Middle Tennessee gets into conference play. And I definitely get that. However, after a week 3 matchup against Georgia, Middle Tennessee has a bye in week 4. So what's going to happen is a lot of fantasy owners' patience are going to be tested because they're going to be like, haven't gotten anything from Ty Lee. He just had a clunker potentially against Georgia. He's not going to be able to play for me next week. How can I even consider him on my roster? So it'll be interesting to see what fantasy owners do with him as Middle Tennessee gets into conference play. But for me this week, week 3, Ty Lee, wide receiver, Middle Tennessee, is a bench. Now, we're going to go into the starts, guys, and I've got several guys that I like this week. You could probably tell by the way that I was talking about them earlier on the show that they are starts. And I'm going to start right at David Pindell, top of the list, quarterback. As a matter of fact, my list is very quarterback heavy this week. David Pindell, quarterback, UConn, playing at Rhode Island. You know, it seems to be a couple of times every season where a player listed on the bench list gets mentioned on the start list the following week. Last week, Pindell was a bench for us at Boise State. This week, he was a bench for us at Boise State. This week is a start against Rhode Island. He's already got 36 rushing attempts in 2 games. He figures to be a force on the ground this week and probably in the air in week 3. Matchup against Rhode Island. The matchup's just too favorable. Get David Pindell, quarterback UConn, in your starting lineups this week. Marcus Childers, if he's still on rosters this week, because I mentioned their schedule has been brutal. Northern Illinois has struggled early on. They've only scored 13 total points in their first 2 games combined. The schedule hasn't exactly kind. They played at Iowa and they played home against Utah and in the first 2 weeks of the season. And due to a slow start and a week 4 matchup, and here's the thing, guys, week 4 they play at Florida State. So that's where I was saying that was the matchup I couldn't remember. I don't know if fantasy owners are going to have the patience to stick with Marcus Childers after this week, after week 4. He may be a guy that you find on the waiver wire as the season progresses, but he could be a perfect plug and play if you need a spot start this week from a quarterback, because a matchup at home against Central Michigan may be just what you need with all these cancellations going on with the weather. Get Marcus Childers, quarterback, Northern Illinois, in your starting lineup this week. Blake Barnett, South Florida at Illinois. It's still early in the season, but Barnett has done an exceptional job taking over at quarterback, replacing one of the best players in the history of the South Florida program, Quentin Flowers. And in his first 2 games of 2018, Barnett has accounted for 8 touchdowns, passing for 5, running for 3. And I expect another dual threat effort from him this week against a defense that has given up at least 270 yards and 2 touchdowns in the air in each of their first 2 games. For me, Blake Barnett is the definite week 1 start on the road at Illinois. Nathan Rourke, quarterback, Ohio, playing Virginia this week in a game that was moved to Nashville because of the weather. Rourke was a week 1 bust. We know that. He was pulled early. They won 38-32. Quentin Maxwell came in relief and threw 4 touchdown passes. But Frank Solich, as I said earlier in the show, has announced that Nathan Rourke is the team's starting quarterback. And for many fantasy owners, that was all the clarity that they need. Ohio will be led by Rourke going into this weekend. I think the matchup is okay against Virginia. You get Nathan Rourke, quarterback Ohio, into your starting lineups this week. And here we go. Javon Durant, the wide receiver for FAU, playing Bethune-Cookman. Durant was a week 2 fantasy standout, caught 12 passes, 174 yards, and a touchdown in FAU's 33-27 win over Air Force. We know that Devin Singletary is a fantasy beast. He is still going to be a fantasy force this season, but the offense is no longer a one-man show. Florida Atlantic should score a lot of points this weekend in a home matchup against Bethune-Cookman, so expect another big week from Javon Durant, and I would get him and start him in your lineups this week against Bethune-Cookman. And then here's the final player, and I said I was going to get the Khalil Tate in my start bench. Khalil Tate, quarterback, Arizona versus Southern Utah, is a week 3 start. And here is why he's a week 3 start. If you drafted Tate, as many of you have, you're probably still holding on to him. I would imagine he's still on many rosters, and he probably should be, especially with this matchup against Southern Utah on the horizon. But for me, this is a make-or-break fantasy game for Khalil Tate on fantasy owners' rosters. Unless you have an incredible matchup with another quarterback on your roster, you have to give him a start this week against Southern Utah. In fact, and here's the thing, even if Tate isn't his 2017 version of himself, where he's running for 550 yards, he may still give you enough in the passing game to make it worth starting him and giving him an active spot on your roster. So for me, this is make or break week. You're starting Khalil Tate week 3 at home against Southern Utah, and that is the week 3 start bench. It'll be up on the website in a little bit. Thanks you guys for hanging in there. Another long show. We've gone almost an hour and a half. I've addressed all the questions here. Everything will be up on the site for everything that everybody does supporting the site, sending in the emails, all the words of encouragement. The CFF site, myself, we all thank you guys. Thanks for your support. Another good week, and after this week, the regular season is going to be about a 33% of the way done. Good luck to everybody. I hope the cancellations haven't affected you. I hope they affect you in a positive way, that you come out on the other end of this undefeated at the end of this weekend. Hey guys, have a good weekend. We'll talk next week.